He was so surprised. He was sure that he hadn't done anything that warranted this. Now the cops were there and he had no idea why. But then he was taken into a police vehicle and driven who knows where? It was still dark, the birds weren't even awake. But Edward was, and he had attracted the attention of the police. They hadn't explained much to him, just that his boss had told them to find him. Edward Landry could barely afford to pay for both his education and for his elderly mother. He was just a college student, but he had no idea that he would be targeted just days later. But Edward finally found the perfect opportunity. He found a job at a moving company. He was expected to arrive and help carry boxes and furniture to the client's next house. He was happy with the pay, so he took a shot at it. But things would take a wild turn. Edward worked there for a week. It was a training week to see if he was right for the job. He tried his best to make sure he gave his boss, George Sunderland, a good impression. He seemed like a passionate man. George didn't give Edward the impression that he was high-strung. But he would be wrong when his boss found out about something he did. And it would change his life forever. The following week it was Edward's first proper day on the job. But that's when the unthinkable happened. He had car trouble. He had no way to get to work and it was over 20 miles away. How would he get there? Edward thankfully had seen his fair share of hardship and knew that he could always make a plan. He would do anything to get to work. But he was unaware of the problems that would arise due to his solution. Edward made the hard decision. He would walk all the way to work. But it would take him a few hours, so he had to start walking early to there on time. It was a 20-mile walk, and he would do it. As he left for the walk, he thought he had everything figured out. But he had no idea that his boss would find out what he was doing, and he would call the cops on him. But what had he done that was so bad? Edward was feeling tired, but he was almost there. He had walked most of the distance on foot and had a little bit longer to go. He took regular breaks to catch his breath. But the last stretch gave him a second wind. But that's when he saw the flashing of lights behind him. Then he noticed that it was red and blue flashing. He knew exactly who it was, but he had no idea what would happen next. It was a cop car. They flashed their siren and stopped behind him. He wanted no trouble, but he knew how often this happened to people. There was also no one around to see what had happened to him. Two cops slowly got out of their car and walked towards him. On their belts, he could see guns and handcuffs swinging off of them. But he had no idea what they were about to say to him. The policemen looked like they needed sleep. They must have had the graveyard shift. They asked him for ID, so Edward pulled out his wallet to show them. But his first mistake was showing them who he was. Now that they knew that they had the right guy, they asked him something that he would be very reluctant to do. But he wouldn't have a choice at the end of the day. The two cops talked amongst themselves for a second before they looked back at Edward. "Sir, can you please come with us?" Edward's heart sank. They didn't have anything on him, so why were they taking him away? Thoughts flew through his head as they escorted him into their vehicle. Now he would miss his first day at work. But they were keeping something from him. He asked them what he had done wrong, but the men just bellowed with laughter. They told him that they weren't asking him and that someone wanted to see him. This left him with even more questions. But after the cops smirked at each other for what felt like forever, they finally let him in on their little secret. They told him that they were sent by George Sunderland, his boss. Edward was at a loss for words. He didn't understand. He hadn't done anything wrong. How did the police get involved in the first place? The next thing he knew, he was being put into the back of the cruiser and driven somewhere. It was still pitch black outside. At 7 a.m., the sun had come out. The birds were even chirping, and Edward was on his way to who knows where after being picked up by two police officers. All they had told him was who had given them a tip-off to find him, his boss. After 30 minutes of silence in the patrol car, they finally stopped by a car dealership. Edward was confused as ever. But he then saw his boss waiting in front of the car. He had only worked for him for a week. What had he done wrong? But his boss would make everything clear in a moment. He explained to Edward how he had heard about him walking to work since midnight. It was something he didn't like one little bit. But soon, his boss dropped his guard and gave Edward a wink. He didn't understand what was going on.
I'd like to give you this car right here. Today, like right now. Like you can drive away with it.
His boss explained that Edward's mother had called him and told him about his dedication to the job. He further explained that he couldn't bear to let one of his employees do that. Especially after his mother had explained all of the hardship that they had gone through, which ultimately meant that he had to get the job in the first place. George informed Edward that his mother had told him about how they had lost their property in New Orleans as a result of Hurricane Katrina. That they had to move across the country and how Edward not only had to find a way of funding his tuition but also take care of his mother. He said to Edward, "You've gone through enough, haven't you, son?" He winked at Edward once more before handing him a small object. Edward examined them and broke down into tears. They were car keys. His boss had bought him a brand new car so that he could easily drive to work every morning without any problems. He could sell his old unreliable car and use the money to pay for a good chunk of his tuition. Edward was speechless. He couldn't believe how kind his boss was being. He had never experienced human kindness to a degree like this before. He knew that his life would be a lot easier from now on.
Oh, so much.
Walter, who survived Hurricane Katrina, walked in the rain to this.
And that felt nice.
Driving away with a new perspective on human generosity and, of course, a new set of wheels.